Hey there patrons, and welcome to this exclusive tutorial where I'm going to show you how to do card replacement in depth, which is something I covered in the CG Matter tutorial, but I didn't actually go step by step. I didn't show you some tricks that I'm going to show you for this one, and in general, just saying track it, make it a pointer track, and do some compositing. Not that useful unless you already know what you're doing or if you're following very, very closely. So this tutorial is exactly for people who want to know how to do this process at length. Card replacement is useful for faking magic tricks like I did, or you could use this technique for billboards, for pictures, for posters, any planar surface that's rectangular. It doesn't even need to be rectangular technically because a card has rounded corners. This is useful for replacing anything like that. So let's get into it. Let me show you how to do it and hopefully you will learn something. So you're going to need two things for this tutorial, both of which I'm going to make downloadable files, although I already uploaded project files, but I'll add it, whatever. First thing you're going to need is footage that we want to replace, footage that we want to track. So here I have a card, 4 of diamonds, and we're going to replace it with something else. Notice that there's quite a bit of motion blur. There's some focal length changes. I actually zoomed in here. I didn't actually walk closer, but I zoomed in the camera. We have motion blur, we have blurring, we have a whole bunch of stuff, maybe a bit of white balance changing as well. We're going to need to track this, and then the question is, what do we replace this with? What do we slap on top of the card? Well, we replace it with a different card. So whichever card I end up using, I'll also make a downloadable thing, although all of these are already packed together with the blend file that I uploaded in a previous post, but whatever. So you're going to need footage and something to slap over it, regardless of what you're doing. So let's open up Blender and get started. I'll show you the full workflow. And actually, as you can see, we're now in 2.9. It takes me a while to update these kinds of things. I was actually using the 2.91 experimental build for a while, but technically I was running 2.8. But now we're at 2.9, which is cool. There's a lot of features. Southern Shoddy is the one who keeps doing these announcement videos. I don't know what behind-the-scenes connections he has, but he's doing well for himself. Maybe I'll do one of those at some point, if they ever invite me, which they won't. Okay, Blender 2.9. First thing we need to do is import our footage and do motion tracking. Now, normally I advocate for making it an image sequence. Before importing in your video, you want it to be a sequence of JPEGs or PNGs, and that's still true, but it's not entirely necessary, especially if we don't care too much and we're not going to be opening and closing this blend file, which is when this kind of issue typically arises with frame rates and all this. So we're just going to import in our footage. So start off by going to the movie clip editor. This is where we do our tracking. Click open, and this is where we import our footage. And then just find your footage. For me, that is this one. Okay. Couple things. First of all, you're going to notice that the color is off. Some of you are probably on the dot. You're like, CG Matter, stop saying this over and over and over again. And at some point I will, but it is important. The color is off. Just go to the render tab, color management, switch it to standard. And this is going to make the color space nothing weird that alters the footage. Second of all, you're going to notice a couple things. This is 1080p. Let me make that a bit bigger. This is 1080p. And this is roughly 30 frames per second. If these settings do not match our project settings, we're going to have some issues. So, output settings, 1920 by 1080, correct. 29.97, incorrect. So let's make our frame rate that. And depending on your footage, you might actually have to change the resolution. Okay, so now we have our footage in here. Let me actually do a save. Something unique. Unicorns and rainbows. Okay. There we go, so we've saved. If we click play, you see we have our footage. It's actually playing fairly quickly, but you're seeing that this line is turning purple down here, and that means it's going into memory, and we can automate this process. First of all, set scene frames, so that it doesn't go from frame 1 to 250, but frame 1 to however many frames the video is. So in this case, 171, and then prefetch is gonna make everything go into memory. Okay? So that is how we set up, and now we just need to track excuse me, throat can be very, very painful while recording these tutorials. I don't know how I'm making it through this one. Now we need to track. And if you know anything about tracking, there's quite a bit to think about with what kind of tracker we want to be using. Do we want to track only location information, location and rotation, a couple of these, affine, perspective? Long story short, definitely location, because these corners, which we're going to be tracking, are moving. Rotation, because the shot's kind of turning. Scale, because we're zooming in. You could even make an argument for affine and perspective. We're going to see if we can get away with location, rotation, scale. So we're going to choose this tracking type. we are going to hit normalize so that lighting changes, which do exist, especially when my shadow passes over it, so it's not as big of a deal. And now let's try tracking it. So control click the corner. We're going to make that a bit bigger. This is the pattern area. This is what it's going to be tracking. Alt S is going to give us the search area. So Alt S, and this is where it's going to be looking for the patterns. So if we now track forwards, we'll see how it does. Yeah, it's doing frame by frame. It's working out. Once you're confident that it's going to be tracking, once you do frame by frame, which is also Alt right arrow, you can just track forwards, which is Control T, and see how far it makes it, which wasn't very far. We made it to frame 17, and it tells us that we need to correct it because there's been enough error that it's no longer seeing a match. I'm not seeing, it's sticking on pretty well, so you just scale it down a bit. That's considered a new keyframe, and then you track forwards again. And it's running into this issue again. So this is an argument for maybe having affine or perspective as your model, which, by the way, you can change at any time. We could change this right now to affine and have it track forwards. And made it much further this time. Let's just keep doing this same kind of thing. We only need to make it to frame 171 4 times. How long could it take? But it seems like affine's definitely the way to go. It seems like there's been a bit of drift over time, but it's not the biggest deal in the world. We're going to do some correction once we're doing our planar track. So don't feel like you need to have the corners stay exactly in the corners. It's not that big of a deal. Okay, almost done. And I'll consider cutting out a lot of this tracking part of the footage, but then again, this is an exclusive tutorial, so maybe I should leave it all in, and it's up to you if you want to skip that part of the video. The power in your hands, the customer is always right, and I assure you, the person who said that was a customer. Okay, Control L to lock this. You can review your tracker, looking pretty good. So now we move on to the next one. By the way, if you're confident that there's not that much scaling and perspective and all that, the lower you go down here, the faster it tracks, because there's less stuff to look for. So if I did location and rotation, it's probably going to stop tracking pretty quickly, but as it is tracking, it's going to be super fast, as you can see. And yeah, it's a bit off, but it's worth it for the speed. But once it gets that far off the card, it's time to start doing some corrections. So let's see how long we can swing this for. Alt right arrow, frame by frame. Okay, looking pretty good. And again, the better your trackers are at this point, the less correction you're going to need to do with the planar track. But I guess since we're using location rotation, we're just submitting. We're saying, you know what, we'll do the corrections later. For now, I just want to track quickly. And that's definitely a mood that I vibe with right now. Okay. Yeah, location rotation is definitely the way to go, it seems, when it comes to speed. Okay, boom. And then finally, we need to track this corner. Let's make that big. Search area not that big. Oh, made it 80 frames. Let's move it. Let's go back a couple frames, wait for it to be fairly on the corner. We could shift this one down. Track forwards. Okay, cool. So now we have 4 trackers. 4 trackers, and the idea is, actually this is so important. So important, let me put it on the main screen. The idea is we have our 4 trackers. We use this information to convert it into a planar track, which is an entity that has kind of perspective information, kind of like pseudo perspective information using those trackers. So we take our 4 trackers and promote them to a planar tracker, and then we can tell the compositor to slap an image over wherever there is a planar tracker. So let's get to it. Okay. So we have our 4 trackers. How do we promote it to a planar track? Well, it's easy. At any frame, you just select whatever trackers you want. You need to have at least 4 of them. So I'm just going to select our 4 trackers. I think you can use more than 4, but you definitely need 4, that's for sure. You go to Solve, you go to Plane Track, you go to Create Plane Track, which creates a square, which looks very off from our card, but you notice if we click play, it kind of looks like it's stuck onto the table because the card's on the table, and that's the idea of the planar track. So if we now just adjust it, let's find a good frame. A good frame where there's not much motion blur, something like that. If you find a good frame, all you need to do is now put the corners where you want them. And of course, you can hold down Shift for fine control. This is pretty unified throughout Blender. So I'm just making this plane track fit our card. Now, something to notice, unlike a billboard or something, this has rounded corners, which makes it a bit difficult to align the corners where we want them because that information doesn't exist. but I just kind of position these corners wherever I see these lines kind of converging to. So forget the rounded part. This is where the corner would be if there wasn't any rounding. So that's what I do for this. So just adjust this as much as you can. There we go. And I'm just going to remember that we're coincidentally, I swear I didn't plan this, we're on frame 69, so this is where it's aligned for sure. And if we were to take our 4 trackers, let's make that less visible, H to hide these. You can see we have our planar tracker, which is sticking on fairly well to the card. There's definitely a bit of drift going on here, but you can tell that this is doing the job. So one trick that I did not mention in the CG Matter tutorial is how do you, once you already have your trackers and you don't want to refine them, how do you refine your planar tracker so it's not drifting, right? How do we do this correction after the fact? Well, just go to your plane track, select the plane track so it's there. And first of all, we can rename this to something like card. But second of all, you're going to notice something called auto keyframe, which does exactly what you think, automatic keyframe insertion when moving planar corners. In other words, we can go frame by frame and now adjust these corners so we have the tracking data, which keeps it on the card, but also our adjustments, which corrects it. And these things combined will really make it look like it's locked on. So I'm going to hit auto keyframe, which hopefully sets a keyframe on the current frame we're on. Just in case it doesn't, what you can always do is just move the corners, because that's how it creates a keyframe for each one of these individually, I believe. Although I would imagine that it does create a keyframe on the frame they hit this button. Okay, so now for sure we have a keyframe on 69, but let's call that 70. We can go back 20 frames and do a bit of an adjustment. So by the way, if I was to put this all the way out here, you're going to notice on frame 69, it's where it's supposed to be because we had a keyframe, and then on frame 50, it corrects, even though it's wrong, but intentionally, to where we want it. Which means we could just kind of do this every 20 frames or so. It really doesn't take that long, and it is that extra 10 to 15% that will really make it look like it's stuck on there. So now let's go back to frame 30. And I'm just going to do this every 20 frames or so. And if we kind of go back and play this through and it still looks like it's drifting, you can then go to every 10th frame instead of every 20th frame. And you should expect wherever there's the most motion in your shot, so like in this beginning where I'm about to zoom in, this is where we're going to need to do the most correction, because where there's a lot of motion, there's a lot of drift. Okay, 70 goes up to 90. And we don't need to be super precise through this whole shot because you kind of get the gist. But I just want to show you what this process would look like if you were doing this for real. This is exactly what I did in my, yes, in the tutorial, but this is exactly what I did for the magic 3-card Monty shot in the beginning, and that's why it looked like it was so like perfectly tracked on there. And then kind of like the rest of making it believable that the card that you said is there, the replaced card, is real. To make that believable, half the battle is tracking and half the battle is like color correction and lighting and making it look like the card is properly exposed for the shot that it's in. Because sometimes it's going to look a bit yellow, sometimes it's going to look a bit dark, and we can correct for these things. Now, since we only have 170 frames, we should be getting close. One more cycle of this. Okay, there we go. And then finally, frame 170. Let's do a final correction, and then we can play through and see if it's looking okay. And again, if it isn't, you now, instead of going every 20 frames, you go every 10 frames. And then if it still doesn't look good, which it should, you're going to go every 5 frames. Okay, let's see what we got. So that is really looking like it's locked on. It definitely could benefit. So right here, you're seeing there's a bit of drift. Let me find it right here. There was a bit of drift. So we could just say on this frame, maybe this is where we do our correction. You don't need to correct where everything is already correct. Take that one to the bank, because it is true. Okay, boom. Boom. And let's see if the frames around this also have some issues. Yeah, we could use a tiny bit of a correction here. I imagine that at the end of this tutorial, if you're ever doing a freelance gig, they're like, replace this card. We had our best artists work on this and we couldn't get it perfect. You guys are going to be perfectly equipped for doing this. Okay, let's do one more right here. It seems like this was a very troubled area, and not necessarily because there's a lot of motion, but probably because my trackers sucked. And I didn't put in the work in the beginning. I didn't put in the legwork with the trackers, and now we're paying for it. Okay, that's looking fairly good. And there's a bit of wiggle at the end, but we're gonna let it pass. So here's what we got. I wonder if we can lock to a tracker. Doesn't seem like we can. That's fine. Okay, so there you go. That is our planar track. And just to see what an insertion, so putting an image over it, would look like before we do it for real and compositing, you're going to see that we can actually do this in the viewport. So you can just click open. I have a folder for cards, and let's just pick the, what do we have? 4 of diamonds, and let's make it the ace of diamonds. And you can see what it would look like if it's just put over. Now, I don't know if this kind of like half image thing is a glitch or intentional to show you like a split screen. And I don't know why it's rotating. Maybe it's like a camera depth thing. For now, I don't really care because you can just kind of imagine the rest of it is there. Oh, that rhymed. And also, this is a good way to see where you have a bit of a drift. So like right here, we'd want to adjust this corner. And this is a nice way to do it visually, if you want to do that. So you can see right here, we had a bit of a corner drift. This isn't even something I did from my original thing, just something I'm realizing now. So it looks pretty good up until the very end, where you can do some correction. Let's just do one final adjustment, and then I concede. We'll move on. There you go. So we have our card, or we have our planar track, rather, with the viewport display. This is not what's going to render when we say, Blender, render our final effect. This is just a viewport effect, so let's actually turn it off. Now the question is, how do we do this for realsies in the compositor, and why am I not full screen? How do we do it for real? Well, to do it for real, just go to the compositing workspace. And at no point do we need to do anything with, 3D viewport stuff. Yes, you can make a 3D card with that procedural card generator and track it on that way. I could do a 3D track, but no, we're just going to mess with movie clip editor and compositing. Enable nodes so we can see what we're doing. And first of all, what we want to have is our movie clip, and then we're going to slap a card on top of that. So movie clip is going to be basically our background layer, if you want to think about it that way. So let's import in a movie, and specifically the movie that we're using. By the way, to import in this viewer without any extra stuff, if you have Node Wrangler, Control-Shift-Click for that. And we also want this to be connected to the compositor, because the compositor is what gets rendered, and the viewer is what we see in the viewport. In other words, this is what we see right now. This is what happens when we hit render. Okay, now since this is a movie clip, it means it updates fairly slowly, but it does update as we go frame by frame. Somebody's making a compositor up build on Graphical for Blender, by the way. So there's going to be caching and stuff for the compositor if you get that. And hopefully that gets integrated into main Blender, because this compositor is slow, goddamn. Okay, so we have this, and now what we want to do is slap on our image. So let's import in an image. And I wonder if our ace is already here. Yes. So this is our ace of diamonds here. And you're thinking, okay, I want to take this image and put it over this one. So what do? You put it through an alpha over. And you could either do that or select both of these. And I believe it's Control-Alt-0 for the alpha over. And you can see that automatically, because of the order of operations, we have this, the movie clip in the background in the first slot. And then in the foreground, the second slot, we have this slapped on top. Now, of course, this isn't what we want, because it's just kind of like perfectly slapped on top as the movie's playing. We want this to be kind of confined and corner pinned to the planar track. Is there a node for that? There is. Look up planar track. You're going to use planar track deform. You just kind of put it through whatever thing that you want to be using. And you're going to notice that this actually got rid of our card, and this is because we're telling Blender, take our image and send it through this planar track deform, but it can't do that if we don't tell it what track to use. So first of all, we're saying we're using this footage that we tracked, and from this footage, I want you to select our camera object, which has the planar track inherited to it, which now kind of confines our ace of diamonds to that area, which is going to be perfectly on top of the card, at least as well as our track was, right? So if the corner's poking out, that means your planar track had an issue. You can also isolate this just to see what it looks like with the card alone. But of course, this layer is what we are slapping on top. And the very, very nice thing about a planar track is, even though it kind of has perspective information, not in 3D, it's enough information to actually calculate for motion blur, because you can see how these corners are moving and how. So if we just enable motion blur, Blender can actually calculate for that. So you can see there's a tiny bit of blur here. You can make it much more intense. So this should make it, yeah, now you can see it's very blurred. If you have it 0, it's not blurred. And what you can do is find a frame from the footage where there's a lot of motion blur. So I'm just looking for a frame where there's quite a bit of motion, just to kind of get a vibe for how much motion blur we should be having. Okay, so here we have quite a bit of motion blur, and we just kind of want to match this amount of blur. So if we look at our ace, it's way too sharp. Let's try 0.2. That gives us a bit of blur. I think that's actually a good amount. Now let's compare that to our image. Yes, look at how faded this corner is for motion blur. This is pretty accurate. If anything, maybe 0.25. Okay, so you can calculate for motion blur. That's a cool thing. I don't think I talked about that in the CG Matter tutorial, although it was shown in the node network. And samples is basically saying what's the quality of this. So you can almost think of it as it's taking 16 images, going into subframes and slapping them over with transparency. If you were to only have 2 samples, it's just going to look like 2 images, one that's slightly transparent. So the more you have of this, the better, but also the longer it takes to calculate. Okay, so now we have this, in some sense, perfectly tracked on with motion blur, but you're going to notice that the main thing that's making this look really, really bad is, let's see, this card is very bright. In fact, I want you to focus on how bright the white is versus the brightness of the white here. In other words, we need to do some color correction. So to do that, there's a couple nodes you can use. I'm going to use the gamma node. It might not be the best one for the job, but if you insert gamma for this plane track to form the ace chain of these nodes, I think you make it smaller than 1. Let's see what that does. Yes, that makes it brighter. And the lower you go, the brighter it's going to be. And we want the white to match, and in some sense, maybe this isn't the best node to use. You can also use, and I'm probably going to stick with it, but you can also use like brightness and contrast, which is basically like gain. I think 5 is way too much. Maybe not. You just want to change the brightness until it's matching, and then you could add some contrast to bring back that red. To be honest with you, I did do this color correction when I was doing it for real. I did it in DaVinci Resolve, and I used some version of gamma, which is why it's what I'm going to recommend. So let's try to match the white, at least somewhat. This is already much closer, and then if you're saying, oh, my red isn't punchy enough, you just drop in a hue saturation value and bump the saturation. Just to make the red punchier. Maybe that's a bit too punchy. And just for comparison, here's what we had before our color correction. Really, really didn't match, and just a tiny little adjustment, which you can refine, already makes it look a lot better. You could probably go even brighter with this. Let's see. Yeah, now it's really in there. Punch up that saturation so it doesn't look washed out with the red. There you go, something like that. You can play around with this. But this is how we correct for it. And if you have kind of like auto white balance, or maybe your exposure is changing throughout the shot, what you can do is you can keyframe 0.3. You keyframe that, and then as you progress, you change the value and keyframe again. And that's just if you have changing brightnesses. So if at this point you need the card to be less bright, so you go up to like 0.45 because you zoomed in, and now this actually looks like it fits for this frame, you can add another keyframe there. Okay. One last trick that might not work depending on your situation, especially if you're not using cards, is we could try to blend this in technically a bit more, so a bit of a fade, if you want to do that, and let's talk about how to do that. So with our plane track deform, it outputs, so this is before any color correction, it outputs our card, and it outputs the plane. It outputs the plane. This is basically an alpha for where it is with motion blur included. What we can do is we can actually create another duplicate plane track deform. Whoops. So nothing is different here. This time we're going to use the alpha of the card, which is basically a rectangle with rounded corners saying where is their card. I'm going to send this through, so now it's going to take this black and white image, this alpha, and do the plane track deform to it. So now let's see what that looks like. So now it's the card, but saying wherever the alpha is. And what we can do is send this through a dilate/erode node. In other words, we want it to cut into the mask a little. I'm going to set this to feather, and then it's either a positive or negative value. If I do 10, it's going to feather it but make it bigger. If I do negative 10, it's going to feather but kind of inwards. So this is before, and this is after. Might be a bit hard to tell, but there's a bit of a softening. And what you can do with this alpha overnode is you can say I only want card wherever we have this alpha. So let me actually zoom in a little. So V and Alt V for the zooming. So I'm going to take our mask and put it in the factor. And that should soften it just a tiny bit. And you can see that does do quite a bit. So this is before, which kind of has all these motion blur issues. It's why it doesn't look like it fits. And this is after. In fact, this is kind of the trick for making the card really look like it's in there. Like this frame is pretty believable if you didn't see it in motion. And you could change how much it's cut in. Don't make it too big. So -30. Makes it actually blend in even more, but if we were to make this insane, you're going to start seeing like the 4 of diamonds. Yeah, exactly like that. So you kind of want to pick the most negative value you can do without having any issues. So for me, that's going to be something like -25 or -30, and this is also something you can keyframe for. So let's go to a different frame where everything looks different. Yeah, at this point, you can see, and this is another good way to check for a color. You can see that we need to animate our gamma, make it like smaller so it's a bit brighter, just so it matches with the card, and you can animate it like that and change the feathering. But once you're done, this is pretty much it. You just want to make sure that this whole node network doesn't only go to the viewer but the compositor. And now when you hit render and you do it as like, let's say an FFmpeg, whoops, I don't know, I've never said oop before. Oops. You make it an FFmpeg video. Set it to MP4, you export it however you want. As long as this is going through the composite node, it's going to do everything you need. Again, only compositing and movie clip editor. There's no need for 3D viewport, which is why in post-processing, make sure you have compositing. Sequencer doesn't matter, but compositing enabled. So this is what it ends up rendering. So it actually bypasses this camera because we do not have any render layers node to call for. Okay. So I think that was, how long was that? Let's see, how are we, 27-ish minutes. That's quite a bit of time. So hopefully that is everything you need to know about card replacement. We went super in depth. We talked about how to do the tracking properly in the correction. We talked about how to do that auto keyframing, which is the correction. A lot about compositing, including masks and dilation and a bunch of tricks I didn't show before. So hopefully you're now a master at it. 30-ish minutes is a long time to spend on an effect like this, but once you're doing it in motion, it will only take you a couple minutes depending on how long your shot is. Again, I'm going to try to remember to include the video and 1 or 2 card images that you can use. I'm not going to upload them all because they're already uploaded as a project file, and they take like 250 megabytes combined, which is quite a bit. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you learned something. Thank you for being a exclusive tutorial level patron tier, which is effectively the highest next to the thank you tier, which doesn't really give you anything extra. It's just for people who want to donate a bit more. I hope you are getting a lot of educational value out of these tutorials. And that is the show, boys. Thanks for sticking around.